Hello again. I thought today I would do hopefully a quick video just discussing the meaning of the word fairy. At this point in our modern terms, people have tended to pigeonhole it into this very specific term for little twee winged beings. That's sort of the modern twist that the word has taken. That's not how it used to be understood, so I figured we would sort of start at the beginning and then move forward. In fairness, I do want to say up front that my own usage of the word fairy tends to adhere to sort of the older meaning, so I might have a little bit of bias going into this, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I think there's a lot of confusion around this word and how people use it in general. So I thought this might be sort of helpful to address. When we look up the word fairy, what does the word fairy mean? What you're going to find in most etymology dictionaries is they're going to say that it comes from the Latin word for fate. Fata, or fatum is the singular, fata is actually the plural. There's a couple problems with this, in my opinion. First of all, this is theoretical. Nobody knows for certain that this is the actual root of the modern word fairy. It's one of those reconstructed theoretical etymologies that people sort of repeat as if it's definitive. It's one that many scholars favor, but some scholars do question. There's a very good article in the book The Good People, New Fairy Lore Essays, which was edited by Narvaez, I think is the editor's name. I highly recommend that book in general. It has a lot of good material in it. But there's one particular article in there that discusses in depth the word fairy and its history. That does sort of question this etymology, linking it back to the Latin word fate. And I think it's legitimate for us to sort of question that, just because it is the accepted, every dictionary is going to tell you this is the etymology. It's a bit problematic for several reasons. It's certainly possible. The theory is that it's rooted, if you go back even further, in the Proto-Indo-European word. I'm not even going to try to say it. It's like a little asterisk, which means it's reconstructed. We don't know for sure if it exists. Scholars have just theorized it exists. So asterisk BHA, which means to speak or to say. And then that word, in theory, evolved into an Indo-European word, which evolved eventually into the Latin word fatum, which means fate, the plural being fata, fates. And then fast forward a bit, somehow evolved into the Old French fay. This is where it gets complicated and where I kind of question it. So the Latin means fate or fates. Fates, of course, being these supernatural beings, three of them, who controlled a person's destiny. It's like the super Cliff Notes description of what the fates are. When we get up to where we see the word sort of reappearing, if you will, in Old French, that's not what it means anymore exactly. Although we do have fae in other contexts and other languages that does have sort of a similar connotation relating to fate or fated. The problem is the concept of fae as in fate or fated, usually with the implication of to die, like fae in the sense of he's fae, he's fated to die, he's omened to die, does not come from Old French rooted in Latin. That meaning of fey, which we usually see spelled F-E-Y, comes from Old English connected to Old German, I believe. Proto-Germanic, comes from Old English and Old Norse, from the Proto-Germanic. So even though the words in English sound identical, the French is F-A-E, fey. The Old English is F-E-Y, fey. Or I should say, comes from the Old English. I'm checking my notes to make sure I'm not messing this up. Comes from the Old English F-E-A-G-E, doomed to die, fated, destined. They're actually completely separate individual words and concepts from completely different languages. And I think this is what's causing us a lot of confusion and problems here. When it's showing up in French, people are sort of attributing it the same concept that we see it having in the Old English and the Norse and the Proto-Germanic, and then just sort of sliding that over into this idea of these supernatural beings who have control over our destiny and fate. But that's not how we see it appearing in the French. And I am getting there. I just want to sort of establish this all as a base. When we see it appearing in the French, that happens around the 12th century, it is more of an adjective and not a noun. It doesn't mean a supernatural being. It actually refers to the land of fairy, the place that these supernatural beings, otherworldly beings, live in. This is referring specifically to the word fairy at this point. Although the word fae has a similar context. This is why when we see in the 12th century the stories of King Arthur with Morgan le Fay, Morgan of the Fae, Morgan the Fae. It's the idea of Morgan of fairyland, Morgan of the fairies, not Morgan who is a fairy, which also I realize super confuses people. So when we see it first appearing in the French, it's not talking about fairies as beings who are these supernatural control your destiny beings, and it's not appearing the way we see it in Old English as this concept of fated to die, death-omened fae. We see it appearing in Old French in the 12th century, the concept of fairy being a word that refers to the otherworld specifically, and also applies to enchantment, magic, or witchcraft in general. So you could have a human person who would be described as fairy or fae because they were enchanting or magical, or they practiced witchcraft. So it's a very blurry line here between these things. And again, like I do understand that when we get into how do we define magic, how do we define witchcraft, there's some crossover with influencing fate. That would be a whole other much longer video to get into. But I think when we're looking at specifically what the word fairy means, we do need to keep in mind that overemphasizing this connection to fate and the fates, we just need to be super cautious with this. It's a very tenuous etymological link, which I think people overemphasize because they're unintentionally misconnecting with the Old English and the Proto-Germanic and the Norse meanings, which don't apply. It's just a completely separate, just picture it over here, out of frame. It's not part of this discussion. What we have here is really the Old French, and whether that came from the Latin or not, I'm personally skeptical. That is what most sources will tell you. I do recommend reading that article in The Good People, though. See what you have to say after you read that. But moving forward, we have this appearance in the 12th century of this word, wherever it came from, that means the land of fairy, the otherworld, the place that these supernatural beings come from. And from there, we then see in the 13th century, so we've gone from the 1100s to the 1200s here, fairy as the country or home or sort of land of origin of these beings. Now, I'm sure you're sitting there at this point wondering, if we're calling the place they live fairy, what do we call them? Well, what we're calling them at this point is elves or goblins or other specific terms. That was what they were referred to in the material at this point, for the most part. Although what we see very quickly happening as we more and more see the word fairy being used for the place they come from is then in sort of the written material as it goes on, referring to the beings that come from that place as fairies, meaning simply, beings who come from fairy. Sort of like Americans are people who come from America. It's the same exact sort of concept. Fairy is where they live, fairies then are what they are, or a fairy, un-American. So, if that makes sense to everyone, this is sort of how this word is evolving. We see Chaucer writing about them in around the 12th century. He refers to them interchangeably as elves and the land of fairy and as fairies. And then as we move forward, we start to see them still referred to as elves and fairies very interchangeably. And the land is called fairy. The land is also called elfland or elfheim, particularly in the Scottish material. The word fairy has always had this sort of double or triple implication to it. It is the place that they are from. It still remains the place that they are from. To this day, you can refer to the land of fairy, fairyland, or just fairy. When I do that, I tend to do like a capital F, fairy, when I'm writing about it to reference the place. You can also use the term to talk about the beings who live there. In general, anything that comes from the land of fairy is a fairy. It doesn't matter if it's a fairy dog, a fairy horse, an elf, a goblin, a giant, a little tiny fairy. Anything that comes from that land is technically a fairy, a being of fairy. There's also always been this third application, which we see even when we go back to the Old French, this implication of having associations with magic or witchcraft or enchantment. And we used to see the word fairy applied to humans who were magic users, particularly workers of enchantment. Now, I have in a previous video discussed the sort of crossover between sex and sexuality and fairies. That applies here as well, because what we see happening, particularly I believe in the 1500s, is the use of the term fairy for women who were considered morally loose or sexually free, I guess we'll say. They became known as fairies. And this was not to say that they were literally beings of the other world, but it was drawing a direct connection between the existing belief that beings of fairy were very sexually free, and we've talked about the fact that they were equated to incubi and succubi and sexual demons. That fairies were very interested in sex with these women, human women, who were considered to also have a similar voracious sexual nature, we'll say. So we start to see the use of the word fairy being applied to human women in this sense. Yes, it was a pejorative. I'm not a fan of pejorative terms, but it is. Now, moving forward, as we get into the 1600s and the 1700s, and clearly this still sometimes is used today, we see the term fairy then being applied to homosexual men for the exact same reasons. It had this connotation of sexual deviancy, because obviously in the 15th century and 16th century, if you were a woman and you had the nerve to be sexually free or sexually voracious, then obviously you were deviant. That was sarcasm, by the way. So it had already had this association with women who were, loose, and it sort of crossed over and started to be applied to men who were considered equally sort of outside the bounds of accepted standard mainstream morality, if you will. And all of this really gets back to the fact that fairies themselves were seen to be outside the bounds of mainstream human morality. And sort of the implication that if you as a human were acting in that same way, you were, by association, acting like one of the other crowd. So we sort of see this switch with the word. Now we hit the 1900s. The Victorians. Victorians. They mess everything up. So, Victorians. They basically took fairies, and I emphasize took fairies, and reinvented them in a lot of ways. They made them very childlike, they made them very tiny, they made them very innocent in a lot of ways. They tried initially to sort of desexualize them. That ended up not working, and then we ended up with like sexualized childlike fairies, which is super creepy and inappropriate, but there we are. There's a lot of artwork out there from the Victorian period, which is pretty horrifying to me anyway. But this is kind of where we start to see the issue coming up with the word fairy specifically being associated with these tiny Tinkerbell-like beings, which had never been the case before. And it is really specifically something we see with Victorian middle class, particularly American and English culture, if you will. This idea that fairies are these tiny, twee little things. If you look outside of those two cultures, at like traditional, even Scottish and Irish cultures, although they do of course have terms for these in their own native languages, which are not English, for anyone who wasn't already aware of that, when you translate the terms, they tend to get translated as fairies. So the word she, for example, which is usually spelled either S-I fada or S-I-D-H-E, is translated as fairy hills or fairy mounds into English. Ace she or Thina she is people of the fairy hills, people of the fairy mounds. We just use that word fairy as the best equivalent to the Irish terms, for the reason that the older meaning of fairy is exactly what those words would mean. Beings of the other world. Those I hate the word supernatural, by the way, but those non-earthly beings who exist in the other world and occasionally come into ours. Fairies. Beings from fairyland. And Shil'ela, the other world. That makes perfect sense if you understand what the word fairy used to mean, and does still mean if you're not applying this super modern Victorian Disney-fied understanding of what fairies are. I know it causes a lot of confusion now, because people do have this sort of mindset that no, fairies are these twee little things, so then it doesn't make sense why the Irish words are getting translated the way they do, if that's what you're picturing. So you just have to like rewind a couple centuries and get into the older understanding of what fairy means, both as a place and as the beings from that place. Even today, if you look at the traditional cultures that have kept those older views and not sort of succumbed to the Victorian influence and the New Age influence and some of the other things that have happened in the last 100 years or so, you'll see that they do still understand them as taking various forms, various sizes, being potentially malicious, potentially helpful, largely ambivalent to humans, that older view, which is also what used to apply to the concept of fairies in general. I will add, as we're wrapping up here, it is generally considered bad to use the word fairies. It offends them. There's a whole ton of euphemisms that you want to use instead. Maybe I'll do my next video about euphemisms and why we don't say the fairy word. I just thought it was important to do a video explaining what the word fairy means, what the connotations and contexts are, and why they're not just twee little Tinkerbell things. I also want to add quickly, as we're wrapping up, and hopefully I've touched on everything I could possibly touch on about this word, there is no real spelling of the word fairy. The modern accepted academic spelling today is F-A-I-R-Y. That's the spelling I tend to use. That's what you'll find in academic works, which is why I stick with it. I'm also severely dyslexic, and for whatever reason, my brain hates A-E combinations. I cannot ever keep straight which one is supposed to go first. I constantly reverse them, and it never looks right to me. So I hate spelling fairy with an A and an E, because no matter how I do it, it looks wrong to me. However, that said, fairy has always had a non-standard spelling up until recently when academia kind of decided to stick with the AI. If you go into the older source material, go back about 100 years and more, you will find a ridiculous number of variants for how to spell this word. You will find it spelled with an initial F. You will find it spelled with an initial PH. That is also true with elf, by the way. You'll find it with a final F and a final PH. You will find it spelled with an AE. You will find it spelled with an AI. You'll find it spelled with a Y. You'll find it spelled with an IE. Just basically any letter combination you can imagine. At some point, fairy has been spelled that way. Especially if you get into some of the Scottish material, and we're getting into like Scots. It gets really interesting with how the word has been spelled. There really is no one true, this is the legitimate way to how to spell this word. Spell it however you want to spell it, and it's fine. There's no one genuine way. I get asked a lot why I spell it the way I do, and that's why, A, because of the dyslexia, and B, because that's how I read it in academic material, so it's just easier for me to stick with that. If you want to spell it E-A-A-E, whatever, if you want to spell it with Y, without a Y, whatever makes you happy. But just understand that there is no one perfect way to do it, and there is no one genuine or real way that the word is supposed to be spelled. Realistically, the majority of spelling in English and most other languages was non-standardized up until 150 years ago or so. So there's going to be a ton of spelling variations for most words if you go back far enough. So don't stress it. This is what I tell myself because I'm a terrible speller. It's all good. As long as you can read it and understand what it says, you're fine. So that is everything I have to say about the word fairy. Its history, what it's rooted in, or what it might be rooted in, confusion between fae and fae, and how the word has sort of evolved into today, and why I think maybe we should rewind it a little bit and stick with some of the older understandings of the word. That's just my opinion. Take it or not, however you want. But when you see me talking about fairies and fairy, that's where I'm coming from with it. Hope you all have a good day, and if people are interested, I'll do my next video on euphemisms and other things that we can call them besides fairies.